Chapter 25. Damon, however adamant he'd been that there were no shortcuts in the druidic arts, did concede to a small change in plan. Rather than working with plants right away, I would begin working with wind. This might be frustrating, he warned me, as we made our way about halfway down the slope to the beach. I didn't start with wind until a few years in. He shrugged. Then again, you saw the life force quickly enough. Maybe by the end of today, you'll be able to make a very nice little storm. We can hope. I chewed my lip as I stepped carefully down over the rocks. They weren't covered in seaweed, not so far up, but they were still slick with salt spray. Down below, tourists were strolling along the white sand, looking for sea glass and shells, or just savoring the quiet. I tilted my head as I watched them. What are you thinking? Damon's voice was soft. It's a good life, I told him. Not having magic. I don't remember everything yet, but I remember I wasn't unhappy. They kept you without magic that whole time. He settled down on the rocks and frowned. I guess I thought. Well, I don't know what I thought. Do you know what happened after your fight with Tarek? I dreamed some of it last night, I admitted. I hate the memories. They seem like they happened to someone else. I tried to steady myself. I woke up, and they had wiped my memory. I was scared. It was to sorcerers, and to humans. I don't know why they were working together, and they argued about just killing me. They'd taken my magic, or it was still drained from the fight. One of them, a human, was sure that I would be needed in the future. So they decided to wipe my memory again and keep me hidden. I shook my head. I don't know anything more than that. I don't know who they were. I don't even know. I guess I thought it was right after the fight, but I can't be sure. Damon said nothing, but his frown had deepened. What is it? I asked him. I thought it was the monarchists that saved you, he said quietly. They were the ones who had you when I found you. I thought they'd been keeping you safe all this time, but that doesn't make any sense. You'd have your magic back by now, and Julius wouldn't have been surprised to see you alive. He shook his head. Philip, he corrected himself. I keep forgetting. God in heaven, Philip Allaire had Tarek's ear for years and we didn't realize. You knew who he was. Everyone knows. Well, if they studied the war. Damon shook his head. He was always at her side. Well, your side, I guess. He was her confidant. People knew that if they wanted her ear, they had to win him over, too. I looked away. Do I remember any of it? Damon asked me quietly. He sounded like he wasn't quite sure he wanted the answer. I felt my cheeks heat at the memory I'd seen, and I turned my face into the breeze. I took my time before answering. I don't know how much we truly cared for one another, I said honestly. I think a lot of it was the plan, and just being two people against the world together. We were both powerful and young. I was young, anyway. I looked over at him. How old is Philip? Not much older than you, I think. Damon shook his head. I'm not sure. Let me think. He was born in Britain, I think. How he got to France, I don't know, but that's where you met him, a while before the assembly. Do you think he gave you the idea for all of it? I don't know. I had been resting my elbows on my knees, and now I pushed myself up. It doesn't matter, though, does it? I did it. I spoke to everyone at the assembly and argued for it, even if the idea was his first. You talk about it like you're still the same person, Damon said. I am. I looked at him, just looked. The wind blew my hair across my face and I didn't move even to brush it away. I held his brown eyes and felt my heart break. He kept trying to believe that I wasn't Nicola Beaumont, and that could only hurt him. He kept seeing, after all. He'd seen me with Esh. He'd seen me kill the flower. He knew who I was. He just didn't want to believe it. If we were wishing for things, I'd wish for the same. But I didn't have time for wishes. Teach me about wind, I said quietly. He looked away from me, out to the water, and I thought he might refuse. But he gestured for me to stand on one of the rocks, facing back toward the cliff. You can feel life, he told me. Wind has a different sort of life, but it's still life. See if you can feel it, not on your back, but the little pieces that slip around your sides into the hollow you're making. I nodded and closed my eyes. This time, it wasn't long before I could see the steep hill mapped out in tiny flares of music. Ants and beetles scuttling. Lichen on the rocks, even the soft, tentative sound of chicks forming in the egg. There was a nest nearby, guarded by an anxious mother. I tried not to hear Damon. Now that I knew what to look for, it was hard to try to listen for the wind with so many sparks of life all around me. I was terrified that the second I let my concentration slip, I would unleash my power on all of them. I had to stay vigilant. I had to protect them from me, and no matter how I tried to keep myself away from them and listen for the wind, I couldn't hear a damn thing. I stood. I sat. I leaned my head in my hands. I opened my eyes and stretched a few times. I snuck a covert glance at Damon every time I did, only to find him staring out to sea with a look on his face I didn't want to try to interpret. The sun was high in the sky, and I was beginning to get sunburned by the time I gave up. My head was aching fiercely, and I could see a touch of pink on my skin. I clenched my fingers on my knees and tried to summon the energy for one more attempt. Rest for a bit, Damon suggested. He was looking over at me now, smiling. Come walk in the sun. I have to get this, I said stubbornly. It took me quite a few months, he advised. If you sit still long enough to do it in one go, you'll get covered in lichen. He offered me a hand, and I winced as I stood. I tried not to hobble as we made our way down to the beach, but once we were there, I felt far better. I pulled off my boots so I could walk barefoot on the sand, and Damon joined me with a grin. When I took off for the water, I heard him laugh as he followed. We splashed into the shallows. The water was warm on my bare feet, and I didn't care that it was soaking into my jeans. There was sun and water, and I was entirely happy, until I turned and saw Damon. He was walking quietly, hands in his pockets, and staring down at the ripples the water made on the sand. He hadn't said a word, but he didn't have to for me to see how worried he was. Damon. He looked up guiltily and gave a forced smile. Yes, you're worried. He looked around as several children raced past, shrieking something about pirates and stolen shells. His face softened when he looked at them, but he looked sad. Did druids have children? I wondered. I'm worried about the Acadam, Damon said finally. If Tarek's still alive, they should be safe enough, but things are moving fast now. And I'm not sure they're prepared. You've warned the druids, right? As well as I could. He shook his head. I don't know if they've gotten the message yet. I don't know if they'll get it in time. And I'm afraid to contact the Koimil. His face twisted and he dropped his head back. Are you all right? I've never broken with them before. On anything. He opened his eyes and looked out at the horizon. I served them because I believed. I brought skills to the hunters that they didn't yet have. I want to trust that right now they would understand about you, about what Philip is doing. And I don't think I can. I stayed silent. I wasn't sure they could trust him about me. Damon seemed sure that I shouldn't go back to stand trial, but who was he to decide that? Who was I to decide that I deserved a shot at redemption? And I can't forgive them, Damon whispered. I brought them children. Children, Nicky. They were helpless. I told their parents that the Acadam was the one place they'd be safe, and some of them were just murdered as soon as I was gone. Maybe Philip was lying, I said quietly. Tarek admitted it, Damon said flatly. It was the truth. I know why he did it, and I want, so badly, to believe it was the right thing to do. But I brought them back there, Nicky. I promised them a good life. And I brought them to their deaths. He dropped his face into one hand, and I suddenly wondered what we looked like from the shore. A couple breaking up, perhaps. I wanted to wrap him in my arms, and I knew I couldn't. I stayed still, the wind blowing my shirt against me, my hands clenched into fists. There were no words that would make this better. Damon knew none of this was his fault, and he still couldn't absolve himself. It's going to be made right, I told him quietly. All of it. I walked to his side, feeling the current dragging at me. I laid my hand on his arm. It's going to be made right by you. He looked down at me, and I felt a little flicker of something like fear. I'd never seen his eyes that way before. And then it changed. His head jerked around. Run, he said tersely. I cast a look over my shoulder and froze. There, walking across the water toward us, was a figure in a dark hooded cloak. Staring right at me,